They built it to stop a Soviet invasion, but it ended up saving American lives for 50 years. The Air Force called it obsolete. The soldiers called it sacred. So what made this slow, ugly beast more feared than any stealth jet alive? You're about to find out why the A-10 Warthog became the most unstoppable warplane ever forged in battle. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't fast, and it sure wasn't meant to impress anyone at an air show. But when the battlefield turned into chaos, when tanks rolled, rockets screamed, and soldiers begged for help, this ugly machine became the sound of survival. The A-10 Thunderbolt II. To its enemies, it was death from above. To those on the ground, it was salvation with wings. They called it the Warthog, a name that perfectly fit its rugged, scarred skin and guttural growl. Yet behind the unflattering nickname lies one of the most extraordinary aircraft stories ever forged in war. The Warthog wasn't built to win beauty contests. It was built for one job, and one job only: to fly low, take punishment, and destroy anything threatening American soldiers on the ground. But to understand how such a brutal, almost primitive machine came to exist, you need to go back to the uneasy years after World War II. The war had ended, but peace was an illusion. The world split in two, West and East, democracy and communism, and the United States found itself staring across the Iron Curtain at the Soviet Union. Both sides were building weapons faster than ever before, pushing aviation into an age of pure speed. Sleek jets replaced propellers, nuclear bombers promised to end wars with a single strike. Fighters soared higher, faster, deadlier. But in that race for the sky, something crucial was forgotten: the soldiers left fighting below. During World War II, planes like the P-47 Thunderbolt had supported ground troops with relentless gunfire and bombs. In Korea and Vietnam, the US tried to fill that role again, but the new jets were too fast, too high, too fragile. They blew past their targets before they could even aim. Helicopters tried to help, hovering close to the fight, but they were slow, vulnerable, and easy to kill. By the late 1960s, American troops were dying for lack of something simple: a guardian in the sky that could take a hit, strike back hard, and stay until the job was done. The Air Force finally admitted what few had dared to say: the modern jet age had left a gaping hole in its doctrine. The generals needed a machine that could do the one thing no high-tech aircraft could: get dirty. So, in 1966, they launched an experiment called the AX program, Attack Experimental. Its goal was not elegance, not speed, not altitude. The mission was brutally clear: create a flying sledgehammer, a warplane that could protect infantry, tear through armor, absorb enemy fire, and still limp home. And this time, the designers didn't start with a plane. They started with a gun. At the heart of their vision was a monster, the GAU-8 Avenger, a 7-barrel rotary cannon capable of firing nearly 4,000 rounds a minute. The shells were the size of beer bottles, each filled with depleted uranium that could punch through the top armor of a Soviet tank like a hot knife through steel. The weapon was so massive that engineers were ordered to build the aircraft around it. The gun wasn't the accessory, it was the reason for the plane's existence. When Fairchild Republic's design won the competition, it was christened the A-10 Thunderbolt II, in honor of the P-47 that had once done the same job in Europe and the Pacific. But pilots gave it a different name, the Warthog, and wore it like a badge of pride. Every line of the aircraft screamed defiance against convention. Straight wings for low-speed agility. Twin engines mounted high to avoid ground fire and keep the plane flying even if one was hit. A cockpit encased in a titanium bathtub, strong enough to stop cannon shells. Hydraulic systems doubled and even backed up by a manual reversion control, so that if every wire was cut and every fluid line ruptured, the pilot could still steer home with nothing but muscle and willpower. Nothing about it was glamorous. Everything about it was survival. The Air Force brass, obsessed with sleek, multi-role fighters, tried to kill the project more than once. They called it obsolete before it was even born. But the men on the ground, those who knew what it meant to fight with tanks closing in, knew better. They didn't want a fighter that could dance. They wanted a brute that could take bullets, eat shrapnel, and keep flying. When the first A-10s rolled out in 1976, they looked prehistoric next to the shiny F-15s and F-16s of the new generation. But the pilots who trained in them discovered something no computer could match: the sense that this aircraft was alive. Heavy, deliberate, unshakable. It felt more like strapping into a tank with wings than a jet. They learned to fly low and mean, below the clouds, under radar, where the real fight lived. And when that 7-barrel cannon roared, the world trembled. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt, like the growl of an approaching storm. By the time the Cold War reached its peak, the Warthog had become the one weapon NATO trusted to hold the line. In a war expected to be fought with thousands of Soviet tanks charging through Germany's Fulda Gap, this ugly bird would be the thin steel wall between survival and annihilation. And though the battle it was built for never came, its legend was only beginning. Because soon, very soon, the A-10 would prove that beauty doesn't win wars. Endurance does. The A-10 Thunderbolt II wasn't designed to look right. It was designed to survive. Every inch of its body was built around one brutal idea: stay in the fight no matter what happens. At its heart sat the GAU-8 Avenger, a cannon so large it looked absurd on an aircraft. 7 barrels of forged steel, each barrel longer than a man. Together, they could spit out 65 rounds per second, 30mm shells tipped with depleted uranium, each capable of slicing through a tank's armor from above. When that gun fired, it didn't just echo, it shook the earth. A deep, metallic growl, the sound of death rolling across the battlefield. Pilots called it the voice of the Warthog. Soldiers on the ground called it an angel's roar. The cannon alone weighed nearly 2 tons. Its recoil was so violent that engineers had to mount it slightly off-center, just enough so that the firing barrel aligned perfectly with the aircraft's nose, keeping the recoil balanced. If not, each pull of the trigger could send the plane off target or even out of control. To feed this beast, the A-10 carried an enormous drum inside its belly, holding up to 1,150 rounds. The system didn't eject casings like other jets. Instead, it recycled them back into the drum, preventing shell damage mid-flight. Hydraulic motors powered the feed system, and even if one hydraulic line was shot out, the other kept the gun alive. Everything about the A-10's engineering followed that same rule: redundancy and resilience. The cockpit was wrapped in a titanium bathtub, a shell of armor designed to keep the pilot alive even if the plane was shredded. It could absorb hits from 23mm anti-aircraft guns, enough to destroy most jets instantly. Behind the armor sat a forest of reinforced systems. Fuel lines doubled, flight controls duplicated, hydraulics mirrored from one side to the other. If one system died, the other took over. And if both died, there was still a third, a manual reversion mode that allowed the pilot to physically muscle the plane home. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't easy, but it meant life. Even the landing gear carried that same defiance. It didn't hide completely inside the fuselage. The wheels stayed partially exposed, so if the hydraulics failed, the aircraft could still land safely. There are stories, many of them, of Warthogs crawling back to base on one engine, a hole in the wing, and half a tail missing. The engines themselves were mounted high on the fuselage, a strange, almost awkward design. But there was logic in that ugliness. By sitting high and apart, the engines were protected from ground fire and debris. They could keep running even after taking shrapnel. Their placement also reduced the plane's infrared signature, making it harder for heat-seeking missiles to find their mark. Below those engines stretched straight wide wings, perfect for slow flight and sharp turns. They allowed the Warthog to loiter over the battlefield for hours, circling, watching, waiting for a call. Unlike the supersonic fighters that had to flash in and out, the A-10 could hover in spirit, never leaving its soldiers alone. Under those wings hung an arsenal that defied imagination. 11 hardpoints, up to 16,000 pounds of bombs, rockets, and missiles, Maverick anti-tank missiles for precision strikes, cluster bombs for clearing convoys, Hydra rockets for soft targets, even air-to-air missiles in case survival demanded it. But no matter the loadout, the center of its soul was always the cannon. That thundering gun gave the A-10 its rhythm, short, 1-second bursts that turned steel into ash. The pilots called it walking the rounds, guiding streams of fire like a paintbrush across enemy armor. In testing, the engineers discovered that the gun's exhaust could choke the engines mid-flight, cutting off oxygen and causing flameouts. The fix was simple, brutal, and brilliant. They added a gas scoop under the gun to redirect the smoke, changed the chemical formula of the propellant, and wired the cannon into the ignition system. If the engines ever coughed during firing, they'd automatically relight. This was the mindset behind every bolt, every weld. Make it foolproof, make it fearless. The A-10 wasn't about speed, it topped out at barely 400 miles per hour. It wasn't about altitude, it hunted close to the ground, but in that low, dirty sky, it was untouchable. Its turning radius was tight, its control precise, its ability to stay airborne after punishment almost mythical. Fuel tanks were self-sealing, designed to close instantly when punctured. Armor plates were interchangeable in the field, replaced by mechanics with basic tools. The airframe could be patched, repaired, and sent back to battle within hours. Even its canopy, simple and unassuming, was built to resist shrapnel. The pilot sat high, surrounded by glass and steel with an unobstructed view of the world below. Every hill, every vehicle, every spark of danger. And then there was the sound, the unmistakable heartbeat of the Warthog. When the cannon fired, a cloud of smoke followed, a rumble that grew into a roar. Soldiers on the ground said it felt like thunder breaking through the air itself. That's what made the A-10 unique. It wasn't just a machine, it was a promise that someone above was watching, a promise that no tank, no gun, no enemy could break the will of those below. And in the years to come, when real wars finally came calling, that promise would be tested again and again, because the day would come when the Warthog stopped being an experiment and became the most feared sound on the battlefield. The A-10 was born to fight a war that never happened. It was built for the day thousands of Soviet tanks would pour through the Fulda Gap, for the apocalypse over Europe that never came. But destiny had other plans. Its first true test arrived under a different sun, over the burning sands of Iraq. In 1991, Operation Desert Storm became the proving ground for the ugliest jet ever made. The A-10's moment had finally come. The open terrain of Iraq was perfect for its design. Flat deserts stretched for miles. Tank columns and convoys had nowhere to hide. And then the Warthog arrived. Low, slow, relentless. It wasn't stealthy, and it didn't need to be. The A-10 didn't stalk its prey, it confronted it. Each sortie began the same way. A dive from the haze, wings cutting through the heat, the cannon already spinning. Soldiers on the ground described it as the sound of deliverance, a deep metallic growl that echoed through the desert. Brrrt. A single burst, 2 seconds long, enough to turn a tank into fire and dust. By the end of the campaign, the numbers were staggering. Over 8,000 sorties flown, more than 900 Iraqi tanks destroyed. Over 2,000 other armored vehicles obliterated, convoys shattered, bunkers pierced, artillery silenced. But the statistics don't tell the whole story. The legend of the Warthog was written in the moments between, when pilots limped home through smoke, one engine gone, the other bleeding fire, yet still refusing to fall. There was the A-10 that returned to base with its tail shredded, one wing perforated, hydraulics gone. The pilot landed it anyway. Another came home with holes big enough to crawl through, flaps dead. Fuselage torn open and still landed on the runway like nothing had happened. Ground crews would walk around the damaged planes in disbelief. They'd touch the torn metal and realize the stories were true. This was a jet that simply refused to die. In the Gulf, the Warthog wasn't feared because of its speed or technology. It was feared because it never stopped coming. When a tank crew heard the growl in the distance, they knew it was already too late. Pilots developed their own rhythm in the fight. They'd circle low, waiting for smoke markers from Allied troops. Then a call on the radio, "Hog inbound." Seconds later, the sky erupted. The cannon's thunder rolled across the sand and everything went quiet. Infantrymen began to describe the sound with reverence. To them, it wasn't just a weapon, it was protection made audible. They'd say, "When you hear the brrrt, you know you'll see tomorrow." When the Iraq War came a decade later, and then Afghanistan, the Warthog returned to a new kind of battlefield. Urban streets, mountain valleys, convoys ambushed on dusty roads. The same principles applied. Get low, get close, get it done. In Afghanistan, the A-10s flew through canyons barely wide enough for their wings. They hunted insurgent hideouts, shredded armored trucks, and broke enemy assaults before they could reach Allied positions. In Iraq, they became the hammer of close air support, defending pinned-down units in Fallujah, Mosul, and Ramadi. Everywhere it flew, soldiers gave it nicknames: the Angel, the Guardian, the Sound of God. And to those it fought against, the same sound meant doom. One Marine officer once said, "You don't have to see it to know it's working. You just hear the roar and you know somebody's getting saved." In the chaos of modern warfare, that mattered. The A-10 wasn't just a tool, it was a bond. Pilots talked to the men below as if they were brothers. They watched their movements, tracked their calls, stayed until the very last moment before fuel ran dry. Many times, Warthog pilots ignored orders to leave. They'd circle back, one last pass to make sure no one was left behind. The bond between pilot and ground troop became unbreakable, an unwritten oath forged in gunfire. The A-10 proved itself across decades of war. From the 1990s to the 2010s, it served in Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. It flew missions that stretched its limits. It hunted tanks, convoys, and even terrorists hiding in mountain caves. And yet, through all of it, the plane barely changed. Upgrades came: a digital cockpit, better targeting pods, GPS-guided bombs, but its essence never shifted. The Warthog remained what it had always been, a flying weapon built for one job: saving lives on the ground. There were faster planes, there were newer planes, but none inspired trust the way this one did. Its pilots didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as guardians, metal angels forged in the smoke of battle, existing for the few minutes when everything depended on them. In every conflict, the story repeated. The roar, the strike, the silence after, and then the radio crackle. Target neutralized. Troops safe. That was the Warthog's reward. Not medals, not glory, just the quiet knowledge that somewhere, someone lived because of its fire. Even as drones and stealth jets began to replace it, even as the Air Force declared its retirement, the soldiers who fought beneath it begged for one more pass, one more roar, one more chance to hear that thunder in the sky. Because they knew what the world sometimes forgets. In war, survival isn't about perfection. It's about endurance. And nothing endures like the Warthog. Time has a way of turning legends into relics, and the A-10 Warthog, the brute that once defined close air support, is slowly being written out of the skies it once ruled. The Air Force calls it modernization, progress, evolution, inevitability. The future, they say, belongs to stealth, speed, and sensors, to drones that never tire, to jets that never show their face. But to the men and women who've watched the Warthog's shadow pass overhead, it's not just a machine, it's a memory, a sound, a promise. For nearly 50 years, the A-10 has served in every war the United States has fought, from the burning deserts of Iraq to the icy peaks of Afghanistan. It outlasted presidents, doctrines, and generations of aircraft designed to replace it. Each time retirement loomed, a new conflict called it back, and each time it proved, again, that simplicity, durability, and heart still matter more than hype. Its legend grew not from the number of enemies destroyed, but from the number of lives it saved. Infantrymen spoke of it in the same tone once reserved for saints. They remembered the sound of the GAU-8 cannon, the burst that split the air like divine thunder, and the relief that followed. For the people on the ground, that sound meant survival. It meant someone was watching, someone who would not leave until they were safe. And that is why the A-10 story endures. Its legacy is not written in steel or statistics. It's written in trust. Trust between a pilot and a soldier, between air and earth. In Afghanistan, they called for it during the hardest days, when convoys were pinned down and the enemy was close enough to hear breathing. In Iraq, they cheered when they saw the low silhouette glinting under the sun, wings wide, engines roaring. In Libya and Syria, its cannon carved arcs of light through the night sky, cold, precise, terrifying. And even as new machines rise, none have yet replaced what the Warthog gives, a human heartbeat behind the steel. Modern war has grown distant, cleaner, quieter, but the A-10 is a reminder of another kind of war, the kind fought close, loud, and personal. It was never about efficiency, it was about presence. When a Warthog circled above, it wasn't a machine watching over soldiers, it was a companion, a sentinel, a creature that bled smoke and roared thunder to keep its promise. Its pilots understood this. They flew low, not just for accuracy, but for empathy. They wanted the people below to hear them, to know they were there. They learned to recognize the rhythm of chaos, to find order in dust and flame, and to make calm decisions in seconds that meant life or death. For them, the Warthog was more than a weapon. It was an extension of will, a reminder that courage doesn't need to be sleek or fast. It just needs to endure, and endure it has. Even now, decades after its birth, the A-10 remains operational. It has survived multiple attempts at decommissioning, each one halted by the same truth. No other aircraft does what it can do. The F-35 can fly faster, higher, and farther, but it cannot loiter over a battlefield for hours. It cannot take a cannon round and come home. It cannot land with half a wing missing. It cannot make a frightened soldier look up and smile. That difference is why, long after it's gone, the Warthog will still echo in the memories of those who lived beneath its wings. Because legends aren't retired, they're remembered. Somewhere, a pilot still hears the gun's mechanical growl in his dreams. Somewhere, a veteran still feels the ground shake and remembers that moment when the sky answered back. And somewhere, on a forgotten airstrip, a single A-10 sits under the fading light, scarred, soot-stained, and silent. It carries no pride, no vanity, no illusion of grandeur. Only the weight of the lives it once saved. When its engines finally go quiet, when the last sortie is flown, it will not fade into obscurity. It will become something greater, an idea. The idea that strength doesn't need perfection, that survival can be forged through flaws, that beauty can live in the roar of a gun built to protect the weak. The Warthog's story is not just about metal or war or engineering, it's about the human spirit, the will to build something that lasts, that refuses to surrender, that stands as proof of what happens when purpose outweighs pride. One day, its roar will be gone from the skies, but the echo will remain in every soldier's heartbeat, in every memory of that thunder rolling closer, in every whisper of gratitude carried by the wind, because even legends die, but the sound of their courage never does. The roar fades, the smoke drifts away, and what remains is silence, the kind of silence that follows after something unforgettable. The A-10 Warthog was never meant to be beautiful. It was never meant to be graceful. It was meant to endure. Forged not in luxury, but in necessity. Born not to impress, but to protect. For nearly half a century, it carried that mission through fire and dust, through the noise of battle and the quiet moments that followed. It was a bridge between air and earth, between technology and humanity, between the living and the lost. Every scar on its frame told a story. Every dent was a memory of someone who made it home. Every mission flown was a whisper of defiance against time itself. They built it to kill tanks, but what it truly did was save lives. That's what sets the Warthog apart from the rest. It never asked for glory. It never sought fame. It just did its job, again and again, long after the world thought it was obsolete. And that's the irony. The very things that made it ugly made it immortal. The thick armor, the exposed bolts, the heavy wings, the monstrous gun. Together they formed something beyond metal, a spirit that refused to break. Now, as the last of them begin to leave the sky, their legacy doesn't vanish. It transforms. Because legends like the Warthog don't die. They fade into memory, waiting to be called upon again when the world needs something unshakable. Maybe one day, the battlefields will be quiet. Maybe machines will fight wars that no one sees. But somewhere, deep down, soldiers will still wish for that sound, the thunder in the distance that meant hope was coming. And when they remember, they'll remember this plane, the one that stayed low when others flew high, the one that came back bleeding and burning but never abandoned its mission, the one that made fear tremble and courage roar. The A-10 isn't just a weapon, it's a philosophy, that in a world obsessed with perfection, survival is its own kind of beauty, that sometimes strength looks like scars, that sometimes the ugliest thing in the sky carries the purest form of purpose. So when the last Warthog lands and its engines fall silent for good, history will not mourn it. It will salute it. Because in the end, this wasn't just another machine of war. It was proof that even in the age of technology, what truly matters can't be designed. It has to be forged. Forged in fire, forged in sacrifice, forged in war.